Hello, everyone. This is just a quick intro. I got to deliver a special lecture about U.S. Navy fighter technology at the Jack C. Davis Observatory in Carson City. And I thought some of you might actually enjoy it. So I had it recorded, and here it is. By the way, at the end of the video, I actually open the lecture to discussion and questions. And so, if you have any during this little lecture I'm posting for you, please let me know in the comments. And also, don't forget to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. I mean, only if you like it, though. If you don't like it, make sure you dislike it, but always tell me why so that way I can fix it. Especially if I do something wrong in the lecture, let me know. Anyway, and one last thing, by the way, if you're in Carson City and have the opportunity, please go visit the observatory. It's actually a really cool place. Dr. Herring is really awesome, and he really runs a really good program out there. So I'll put a link to the website in the description. Enjoy!
All right. So I'm Dr. Tom Herring. I'm the observatory director here at Western Nevada College. You are on campus, even though it doesn't feel like it. The Carson campus, to be specific. To kick us off in 2024, Professor Joseph Bell, history professor here at Western Nevada College, as he mentioned, primarily at Fallon campus, and the topic is on the screen. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and yes, thank you all for coming. We'll be very intimate today, so it's very nice to have small classes. So, and this is actually not going to be comprehensive. I've got 2 lectures that I get to do here, which is great. And I found that that might not even be enough because I basically covered U.S. Navy fighter technology going up to, but not including World War II. So if you want the good stuff, you have to keep coming back for more, I suppose. So there you go. You don't get any points if you leave now, though. So anyway, so basically, we're going to be looking at how fighter technology fit in with U.S. Navy doctrine and how doctrine affected technology and how technology is going to advance and what that's going to make these fighter aircraft look like and the kinds of different concerns that the Navy is going to take into account when it's building these aircraft. And naval aviation has a long history. So none of those are fighter aircraft, by the way, right? And, honestly, naval aviation goes back long before even heavier than air flight was possible. That barge thing right here, that's actually the George Washington Parke Custis, and it was a balloon barge. I don't think it had any sort of like open ocean capabilities, but during the Civil War, the Union would use some of these, like this particular one, basically for artillery spotting. So when they're trying to, in like the Peninsular Campaign, for example, attack targets beyond visual range, they were able to do so with these balloons. And of course, observation becomes hugely important in warfare simply because after the Civil War, gun calibers become enormous. And I mean, so enormous that, you can fire over the curvature of the earth to like huge degrees. And we'll even talk about some of the amazing distances that these guns could shoot at this time period. And so usually when ship designers in the Navy are trying to figure out, well, how can we see further over the curvature of the earth? You just build big old giant superstructures on your battleships, right? And that's why those battleships have those big giant towers. That's why Japanese battleships have the really, really, really big towers, is because they had really long range guns and they wanted to be able to see what they were hitting. And all of that is nice. I mean, a big tower is great, but wouldn't it be even better if you just had an airplane dinking around over the enemy fleet? That way you could actually see where your shots are going. And honestly, that's the primary use of aircraft in World War I. When we talk about World War I, everybody likes Biggles and they all like, the Blue Max and all these cool things because the fighters are cool, right? Let's face it, fighters are sexy. We have to talk about them because they're the cool ones. But really the biggest thing that the aircraft did in World War I was to operate as an adjunct to artillery so that they could hit enemy targets very, very far away. And so if you actually went back in time to the Western Front, there'd be balloons all over the place. There's a balloon right there. You can see on the screen, and this is an observation plane also. And of course, it soon becomes apparent that these observation planes, not only can you spot for the artillery, but maybe you could actually drop a bomb out of your own plane and all of this. And I think that gets us to the fighters, right? And honestly, when we're talking about, I'll give a quick little brief thing. This is what naval aviation looked like in World War I, essentially, right? And that is not a fighter, right? That's a flying boat. And this is a Curtiss-built flying boat that was very, very important, by the way, simply because it was doing anti-patrol submarines in the around the British Isles. So let's get to the fighters, because I think the fighters are the important thing. And I think anybody who's ever had a neighbor fly a drone over your house probably knows the urge to grab a shotgun and get him to stop spying on you, right? I've had that happen to me, actually. I don't know why he was interested in my garden. I just have vegetables, but oh well. And of course, I imagine that urge would be far more pronounced if you were getting shelled. And so the fighter plane, there's one thing that I think is really fascinating about the fighter plane, because fighter pilots tend to be very offensively minded. We're going to go out and get them in that kind of business. But as a tool, as a weapon itself, the fighter plane is essentially defensive in nature. You're trying to defend your airspace. You're trying to defend your aircraft. You're trying to defend your strike aircraft and things like this, right? And so it's kind of fascinating that it is essentially a defense part of a larger weapon system. And so, again, when we're talking World War I, it wasn't long before planes began to be capable of shooting each other down. I have another lecture about World War I fighter planes, but I did that a while ago. I don't know. Anyway, and the United States really wasn't doing much in World War I with fighters. Most of even the Army Air Corps was basically just using a lot of French and British designs. And the Navy wasn't doing a whole lot at all. Remember, this is what the Navy was essentially doing with naval aviation. And that probably shouldn't surprise us, honestly, because I mean, there weren't any aircraft carriers, and so there wasn't a real need to do this. But there are many people who are thinking, well, gosh, maybe we should have aircraft as a part of the fleet. And honestly, again, the Navy, as evidenced by like the Civil War, the Navy was interested in aviation for quite some time. You can look up, I don't know, does anybody know the name Eugene Ely? He's not the guy that Ely, Nevada is named after. I looked it up. But he's like the first American to fly an airplane off of an American ship. Wasn't an aircraft carrier. They like built a platform on a cruiser so that he could get one of those like Wright biplanes to fly. Look him up. Look up Eugene Ely. It's kind of neat. And of course, there's the big old Curtiss flying boats that were doing the anti-submarine patrols that were so important during World War I. But really what we're going to see is that the Navy's fighter aircraft are going to develop alongside the aircraft carriers themselves. And again, I don't think that should be surprising, because honestly, the aircraft carrier itself is a weapons system that fits within that larger fleet as well, with its own job to do. And really, these aircraft have to fit the carriers themselves, much in the same way, like if you're looking at these airplanes, those engines that are on them have to fit the airframe itself. Otherwise, the whole thing isn't going to work. And so, again, the aircraft carriers have to work with one another. And as we're dealing with this this technology, I'm hoping you can see kind of the subtle yet important differences between my three phases. But there's three phases that I think we can divide this technology and doctrine into. Isn't it always nice when you can divide things up so easily? And one thing I do want to say too, I know I keep saying that word doctrine and everything. That's like the basic ideas of how a battle or how a war will be fought, right? So if you get into a bind, you can always know, my instructions say this. I should act in this particular way. And everybody else will know, hey, Tom over here is in a bind. He's got this thing going on. We're cut off, but I know he'll probably do this because we've got this overall doctrine that we're going to do here. And it isn't particularly sexy doctrine, but it's something that's hugely important. If you get nothing else out of this lecture, the importance of doctrine and technology and warfighting and all of this kind of business, it's hugely important. I'll leave it there. Anyway, so the first phase of technology is the appropriately named phase one. That's what I'm calling it there. You can see phase one right here with this beautiful plane. We'll be talking about that particular airplane in just a moment. And essentially what this first phase of fighter technology is going to be is it roughly corresponds with the 1920s. And it's basically a time period of experimentation, of the Navy trying to find its feet, of trying to figure out, okay, what does naval aviation look like? There's a couple of eras in the Navy's history where you see this, and it gets represented with aircraft really dynamically, because you look at some of the designs that they come up with and you're like, wow, that's a weird looking plane. And the reason why is because, well, how do we use these new technologies that we have? How do we actually use them appropriately? The second phase roughly corresponds to the early and mid 30s. And it's in this second phase that we do start to see the Navy start to understand at least what it wants from fighters, what it wants to do, what it wants to accomplish. It's going to have some purpose-built Navy fighters. Actually, it's not until 1934 that the first purpose-built aircraft carrier is actually built. And that was kind of an experiment too. Nobody liked the Ranger, but I guess maybe people who were on the Ranger liked it, but maybe not even then. But anyway, so we do see some interesting experiments. Again, here, the Navy is going to start exploring things like dual purpose aircraft, or you might call them multi-mission. And these will be things like fighter bombers, scout fighters, things like that. And then finally, this last phase, which would get us right up to the cusp of World War II, is going to see the Navy, just getting into some really excellent designs. It might not look like anything super amazing, this particular aircraft, right here, but it does represent a huge technological leap. It has a whole bunch of excellent things, right? It's going to, phase three is going to introduce monoplane fighters using the excellent Wright and Pratt & Whitney engines. And of course, there's going to be dedicated fighters. The Navy is going to kind of shy away from the multi-purpose fighter bomber and say, no, we need planes that are specifically designed to shoot down other planes. But interestingly enough, the pilots will be cross-trained. So even though the planes are dedicated as one particular role, the pilots will actually be trained in different roles. So you could be a fighter pilot, but somebody could say, hey, we need you to fly this bombing mission. Okay, let me step into this other plane. So one other thing to really hammer down here, I might be a broken record, but one thing to hammer down is that the aircraft designers, of course, are going to have to make their design decisions within the limitations of technology. And so what's available, the kinds of engines that are available, the kinds of materials that are available, right? Things like metallurgy have a huge impact on what you can actually do with these airplanes. And the other thing that happens here is when you're constructing a fighter plane, you have certain things that you want the fighter plane to do, right? You want it to be able to shoot down other planes. And so you need your plane to be fast because you have to be able to catch those other planes. You also need your plane to have big guns so that you can shoot the other planes, right? And so on and so forth. I always think of this as like having a bunch of different jars, and each jar is labeled things like speed, armor, wing loading, things like that, right? Turn radius, range, all of this stuff. And you only have a certain number of jelly beans. And the number of jelly beans you get is, of course, dependent on the technology, right? And so if you have a better engine, maybe you get more jelly beans, and you have to figure out which jars you want to fill with which jelly beans. And you get these interesting different planes in all of this, right? And so, again, this is all going to be limited by technology and the airframe and all this kind of business. And so if you think, well, gosh, I want a really super duper fast airplane, that's awesome, but that might cut down on the range, because you want to cut down on the weight to make a faster airplane, which means you cut down on how much armor you can give your pilot. You might cut down on the size of the gas tanks, right? And so you might have the fastest plane in the world, but it can only fly for a half an hour. That's what you want. You can get that, but it might not be the most versatile sort of thing. And then likewise, if you want to increase armor protection, that could be excellent. I'm sure the pilots would be happy about that, except that that's going to increase the weight, that's going to increase the wing loading, that's going to decrease the turn radius, the climb speed, all sorts of different things. And then the Navy itself is something else, because the Navy has all kinds of weird requirements, right? When you're talking about these airplanes, one, ease of maintenance is an important thing for these airplanes. You'll see the Navy taking designs that the Army wouldn't give a second look, simply because it's easy to maintain this thing, right? And shops and crews can be very small on an aircraft carrier, right? You might want to consider extra fuel capacity because, let's face it, the ocean is flipping huge. It's really, really big, and you need to fly in huge areas, right? And also, not only that, but you might want to think about fuel efficiency, since aviation gas storage facilities on aircraft carriers might be very, very small. I could add too, by the way, that it's actually more dangerous to crash on water than it is on land, simply because you can't like get out of your plane and walk away if you survive the crash, right? If you want to parachute out of your plane over land, you'll probably land on land, right? But if you're over the water, you'll probably drown. And so there's a whole bunch of different things that you might want to consider adding into these fighter planes, like flotation devices and life vests and all kinds of things like that, right? And one last thing to consider. Have you heard the word doctrine enough? You getting tired of it yet? Okay, don't worry. We'll be talking a lot more. So a lot of the design choices that the manufacturers are going to make based on what the Navy wants are going to be either reflective of doctrine, or those design choices will influence doctrine, or both. And there's actually a really good example of this. So I don't know, raise your hand if you're a World War II buff and you know a whole bunch about the Pacific War. Okay, that's all right. So there's this really cool airplane called the Japanese Zero. Okay, all right, the Japanese Zero. It's a really awesome one. The Japanese Zero was reflective of the Japanese dogfighting doctrine. The Navy said, we want an airplane that can fly for thousands of miles, get into a big old giant scrap dogfight, outturn anybody in the air, and then fly all the way back, right? The pilots of the Japanese Zero, sometimes they were so long ranged that sometimes they would actually like just set the joystick and then take a nap and then wake up a couple hours later so that they could keep flying to their destination. So they got that, and they got a really good airplane, right? And so that is reflective of the Japanese doctrine. They had zero armor protection, but they had huge gas tanks and they had huge guns, and they could turn really tight. Yes. Doctrine is how you're going to, good, thank you for clarifying. Doctrine is the overall way in which a nation or an army is going to fight, or in this case, a navy. So if we all agree, if we're all in the Navy together and we all say, you know what, we want to make sure that we win any dogfight in the air. All right. So this is how we're going to do it. This is the training we all have. Whenever anything comes up, these are the steps that you go through. That's the basic idea of doctrine. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Awesome. So when the United States met those Japanese Zeros, by the way, they had heavier planes and they couldn't really dogfight them, and they got shot down a whole lot. And so because of the technology that the Americans had, they simply shifted their doctrine. They said, okay, don't dogfight. They adopted what are called boom and zoom tactics. So they'd fly way high, and then they'd ambush, and then they'd get back up high. And that was about all they would do. And so again, there's some really good examples of how technology, doctrine, all of this stuff kind of meshes together. It gets really complicated, and I'm going to try to make it as less complicated as possible. Okay, so phase one, let's get into it. Initially, when we're talking about phase one, naval aircraft are going to be heavily influenced by World War I, and they will essentially be adapted Army fighters. In this case, this one isn't even an Army fighter. This was an Army trainer. And again, initially, this is sort of like a take what you can get kind of thing. There weren't any manufacturers who were purpose building naval fighters yet, because up until 1922, they didn't even have an aircraft carrier from which they could fly. And I think two of the best examples of this kind of figuring things out are the VE7 and the TS1. So the VE7 is right there, and the numbering is going to get both less confusing and more confusing at the same time here in a little bit. But just understand, this is a Vought aircraft. That's the manufacturer. And I want to stress before we get too far into this that the 1920s was this time of experimentation. The 1920s was a wild time, right? I mean, you think of it as the jazz age, right? And if you think about what jazz is, it's like a bunch of improvisation and music and all of this. And that's essentially what's going on in aircraft design as well. And the Navy is going to take a bunch of different designs. They have a very low budget, by the way, and they're going to take a bunch of different designs and they're going to try to figure out, well, what's going to work for us? And they're going to play around with all sorts of different things. Some of these designs are really cool looking. Some of them are kind of like weird looking. But again, the idea here is, well, what technologies can we get and adapt to our needs and everything? And so I think it makes sense that they never really had a huge order of any of these planes. I think the VE7 actually was one of the more numerous of these, but that's because Vought already had a bunch on hand. And so with that said, by the way, if anybody happens to know a 1920s plane and you say that was the best one, and I'm skipping it, I'm sorry, but here we are. So here it is, the VE7. It's a World War I plane. If you look at it, it just looks like a World War I plane. It's boxy. It has fabric covering. It's probably made out of spruce. The ribbing is probably made out of spruce with doped fabric and all of this. And it was essentially a World War I airplane. And to my eye, it actually looks a little bit like the SPAD 13, especially in this picture right here, this one. And I think the reason why is because it shared the same engine as the SPAD 13. That was a French fighter plane that had very good success in the Western Front and other theaters in World War I. And the engine, by the way, it was a Hispano-Suiza 8-cylinder inline engine. And this is one of the very few of the Navy planes that will have an inline engine. And we'll talk about why that's important when we get to some of the rotary engines. But with that engine, it could achieve a maximum speed of 106 miles per hour. I bet some of you have topped that in your cars going down I-80 in your lives. But 106 miles per hour wasn't too bad for the time. It wasn't nearly as fast as some of the British and the French counterparts. The Sopwith Dolphin, for example, could make 120 miles per hour, which would run circles around this one. But it's pretty darn good. The VE7, what it shined in is it had range. So this thing could fly for 290 miles. And that absolutely left all of the other ones behind. The Dolphin, for example, could only fly for 190 miles. And so if you're talking about a Navy plane, range is important, right? And so the VE7, it only carried one 30 caliber Vickers machine gun. And again, that name Vickers is a really important machine gun for World War I. It was a licensed built version. It was a Colt licensed built version. You can tell because it's 30 caliber, not 303 caliber. If it was 303, then you'd say, oh, it's a British gun. And again, you could see the World War I heritage of this particular weapon. And initially, it's interesting because it was never meant to be a Navy fighter in the beginning. It was supposed to be a trainer for the Army. But when World War I ended, the order of 1,000 that the Army had placed essentially was canceled. And Vought already had everything kind of like up and running to go so that it could produce these. And so the Navy, they just simply accepted the VE7 as it was. And then it was a trainer initially. And so if you look at the aircraft, it's kind of got this area right about here. If you can see where my mouse is, that was where the student would sit. And so they just fared that over. Just said, we don't need a student anymore. We'll put a gun there. And so there you go. I mean, a good choice, right? But they went ahead and did that. And they ended up purchasing, the Navy ended up purchasing 128 of these VE7s. And as I said, that was one of the larger purchases that the Navy ever made. Honestly, a lot of them were in like the tens, if not just single demonstration models of some of these aircraft. And it sort of fit the Navy's needs. It was an airplane that could fly off of an aircraft carrier deck. It could carry a gun. It could theoretically shoot down other airplanes, although it never got the opportunity to demonstrate that. And it did stay in service all the way up until 1927. Now, it entered service in 1922, and that's a really long service for this type of aircraft, by the way. At this time period, a 5-year service life is really, really, really long. If you looked in World War I, for example, airplanes essentially became obsolete once the factory could start producing. That's like they were that quick about upgrading these things. And so in 1920s, 5 years is a big deal. So basically, the Navy looked at the VE-7 and said, this is good enough. But is good enough ever good enough? And the Navy said no. And so that gets us to this one here. That's the name of the first U.S. aircraft carrier, by the way, the USS Langley. There it is. And this one is an actual Navy aircraft. And by the way, I'm skipping a whole bunch of things. And if you notice, it also has, it can either be called the TS1 or the FC1. Part of that has to do with who's producing it, but also in 1922, the Navy is going to change its numbering system. And so if you're looking at those numbers, oftentimes what it'll do is mission, design number, manufacturer sub. You don't need to know this. I don't know why I'm telling you this, but if you're ever looking at those things and you say, well, what is the F4F actually mean? It actually means something. And I don't know. We'll talk about it when we get to someone that's a little bit less confusing than TS1/FC1. So this airplane demonstrates the Navy's desire for a purpose-built Navy-centered fighter plane rather early on. It actually came into service roughly at the same time as the VE-7, but it's going to last a little longer, and it will finally be retired in 1929. It was built by this company called the Naval Aircraft Factory, which was a rather uncreatively named aircraft factory run by the Navy. Anyway, they came up with a TS-1 as this purpose-built Navy fighter that would check all of the boxes that the Navy wanted. Things like reliability, things like range, things like all kinds of stuff, right? And you'll notice that pretty much from now on, propeller-driven Navy planes are going to use rotary engines, right? This is the rotary. Can you see the difference between this one and the inline engine there? So this one here, all of those pistons are arranged around the crankshaft, as opposed to the pistons being in a line like a V8 or something like that, right? And so there you go. The nice thing about these for the Navy is they're way easier to maintain, like way easier. Also, they're air cooled. So when you're talking about the coolants and that kind of business, you don't need to have a whole bunch of like oil coolants and, you know, weird things where if a single line gets cut, then all of a sudden everything comes crashing down, right? The aerodynamics are worse because it's not as streamlined and all that, but that's okay. And the other thing, and pilots were usually kind of happy about this, is essentially the rotary engines created a big giant bulletproof plate for your front there. So if you got hit in that engine, the engine might die, but you might not, which is always a plus if you're a pilot. So there you are. So that's one of those big things. From now on, we're pretty much going to be seeing the Navy using rotary engines. It's actually kind of a fascinating thing because the rotary engine is actually a pretty important development. Back in World War I, they used to be, oh, I forget the name for them now, but the whole engine actually span with the propeller in World War I. Wild times, but anyway, so they finally bolted the engine down, so only the propeller spins. In any case, the TS-1, so this one was powered in that engine, the thing I've been talking about this whole time, that's actually the Lawrence J1, excuse me, not rotary engine, radial engine. The rotary engines are the ones that are spinning, and the radial engines are the ones where they stand still. So the J1 is a really important engine, and it has a couple of advantages. We just talked about some of them. The biggest one, though, I think for the Navy was that this is a domestic design. This is an American design. They don't have to license it out from any other country. It also developed 200 horsepower as opposed to the Hispano-Suiza's 180 horsepower. And by the way, 200 horsepower is really good for an aircraft engine at the time. Just believe me. It was also air-cooled, so that's nice. And it was good design, easy to maintain. And really, the engine is going to go on to have kind of like a long heritage. So the Lawrence Company is actually going to be purchased by Wright Aeronautical Corporation. And many of the design characteristics from this J1 engine will be used for the Wright Whirlwind engine later on, which is a much improved design. So anyway, that engine plus the overall aerodynamics of the airplane meant that this plane had a top speed of 131 miles per hour, which was 25 miles per hour faster than the VE7. And 25 miles per hour faster might not sound like a whole lot, but just imagine, like, you guys have driven on the highway, right? And somebody passes you only going 5 miles an hour faster. And you're like, whoa, that was really fast, right? So 25 miles an hour faster is actually a pretty important advancement over that. Not only that, the range is increased. So again, we're seeing the Navy saying we need these planes to be able to go further out. It still had only just the one machine gun, but this time it's a Browning machine gun. So again, we're not talking about licensed built copies of other machine guns, but we've got our own American ones. And so this is kind of the culmination of that first period of experimentation. Again, you'll still see that a lot of the design features here are rather World War I. The engine is something that's going to be very long lasting, but they're still biplanes. This is still fabric covered. I'm not sure what the ribbing is made of, but I know that certain parts probably are spruce. It might have some aluminum in there, but a lot of these you can tell that's fabric covered something. And again, this early period is all about experimentation, finding the purpose, and really consider that up until 1927, the USS Langley was the only aircraft carrier in the US Navy. And that was it. There weren't any other aircraft carriers at all. And again, there's a lot more planes we could talk about that could demonstrate this dynamic of finding our feet, experimenting and all that. But I think the TS1 is actually a good segue, and I'm also trying to not bore you for hours and hours and hours, into phase 2. And that gets us to some more things. And again, I'm hoping you can see some of these subtle differences. Notice one of the things that I always look at is the number of struts on the wings. If you notice, they start getting a lot less cagey and things start getting a lot more streamlined as time goes on. And part of that is simply using better materials, like a hollow aluminum or something instead of just a piece of wood. So remember, what we are calling phase 2 of the Navy's technological and doctrinal development in the early 30s is going to show some good purpose-built Navy fighters, and we're going to see the Navy begin exploring with dual-purpose aircraft like fighter bombers and scout bombers, etc. And we're going to start with these Boeing entries. So did you guys remember how to read the F2B and all that? Oops, sorry, let me go back. The F2B and all this. So F, that designation means fighter, right? So there you go, that's easy enough. And 2 means the second design of a particular company, and the particular company is B for Boeing, right? So there you go. So it's always easier actually if you read these backwards. So it's the Boeing's second fighter, and there you go. And then there's a bunch of other little things. It gets really confusing, but that's what I'm here for. We're all good. So these early Boeing aircraft, not only do they look more modern, but they actually had, of course, better capabilities. And I think they help to demonstrate just how rapid this technology is expanding. Keep in mind that these aircraft are going to enter service only like 10 years after the Navy even got its first aircraft carrier. So again, it's a very, very rapid development that we see. And I'm kind of examining these 2 planes at once. I don't know if you can notice the various design differences between these aircraft. The one that I notice mostly is, if you notice the tail fin on this one, is much more shapely than kind of that, that vertical stabilizer over there. Anyway, so technically they're different fighters, but I'm kind of looking at them as one. And the biggest improvement here is in the engine. This is where we see engine manufacturing really starting to take off. American engine manufacturing is kind of an amazing thing in and of itself in a number of different places, but aircraft engines become really, really powerful, and this is the beginning of that. And so these Boeings will have the excellent Pratt and Whitney R1340B WASP radial engines. And we'll start seeing double WASPs and things like that later on, right? But essentially what that does is this engine put out 425 horsepower, allowing these Boeings to achieve 158 miles per hour. Well, 157 for the F3B. It lost a mile per hour, and I'm not sure how that happened. Maybe more weight or something like that. But anyway. So these airplanes are also going to reflect the Navy's doctrine regarding scout fighters because they have very long range and they're meant to be used to patrol areas, not just shoot down other airplanes. These ones are now armed with two 30 caliber machine guns. And I believe the F2B could actually also carry one 50 caliber and one 30 caliber. So it could have a greater volume of fire. And let's talk about the doctrine here, because again, I'm sorry, I'm talking about doctrine probably too much, but these planes are going to fit into how the Navy wants to fight wars, how it wants to fight these things. And we're going to start seeing the Navy moving into scout bombers as well, not just plain old fighters, but airplanes that can use a whole bunch of different weapons against an enemy, right? And at this time period, right, it's important to note that Admiral Yamamoto hadn't showed in the world that the aircraft carrier is going to be the big weapon of war. When we get to World War II in 1941, basically Yamamoto, this Japanese guy, is going to show the world by bombing Pearl Harbor that, hey, yes, hi, the aircraft carrier, massed air assault is going to be the big thing. And so we don't know that yet. And so the main striking arm of the Navy's was the battleship. A lot of historians will say it was still the battleship. I don't like to say still because why wouldn't it be the battleship? Battleship had lasted for a century, right? It's this big thing, right? I mean, you could say a line of battleships too and go back even further to like the 1600s. But yeah, the aircraft carrier at this time period was seen as just an auxiliary. It wasn't supposed to have the offensive punch. It wasn't supposed to sink other fleets. It was supposed to be there to help the battleships do that. And again, remember, up until 1927, the Langley was the only aircraft carrier in the U.S. fleet. And then from 1927 to 1934, there were only two. The Langley got kicked out, and then there was the Lexington and the Saratoga. Those two became aircraft carriers. And then finally in 1934, the Ranger came in, and that made it three. But again, the Ranger was kind of weird. It was an experiment in and of itself, right? And by contrast, there were about 20 battleships in the U.S. fleet in 1930. The number can be kind of like wobbly. I think it was 18 actually in service. And just think for a second, if your main weapon is the battleship, and if you're standing on the tip top of a tower on a battleship and you can see for 40 miles in any direction, right? How much ocean can you actually see? 40 miles in any direction, right? Can you think about how flippin' huge the ocean is? It's huge. There's this story from World War I where Winston Churchill was really fretting over this particular German fleet in the Pacific Ocean. And his admirals were like, well, Winston, they're somewhere here. And he had this giant map. It's like, our ships can see this far. And he had like a tiny little area that was the size of a head of a pin in this giant map. It's like, how are we ever going to find these guys, right? And so if you have airplanes, though, now you can search for hundreds of miles, right? And so again, it's really an excellent thing. The main purpose of these aircraft is going to be to locate enemy battle fleets. If you have an aircraft carrier with your fleet, that means that you can find another fleet so you can steam towards it and then you can blow them up with your big guns. Yeah.
like the range of like how far, like with the amount of like of gas, like at this time, how far like could they, what was their range? Like how many miles could they fly for?
Well, it depends on the plane, right? So if you look back at these ones back here, that one was 400 and some miles per hour, right? And then we get to these, or no, these ones had the 400 miles per hour. And so it depends on the plane. It depends on the capability. Remember, it depends on which jelly beans you want to put in which jar, right? Because if you want, you could have, like the Japanese, they said, we want a plane that can fly 1,000 miles and still have a fight and then come back. And they did that. But that plane had zero armor, zero self-sealing gas tanks, right? And so it was a big trade-off, right? And so that's what I'm talking about. This is what gets us into the doctrine here. How far do you want to fly? What's the thing? And the US Navy is saying, we want our planes to fly far enough to be able to have a big enough search area where we can find the enemy fleet, but also these planes still need to be able to defend themselves and maybe do some damage to the enemy fleet. Wouldn't it be nice if these aircraft could actually find the battleships of the enemy and then maybe drop a bomb on them? Anything to weaken the enemy fleet, right? Furthermore, I guess I could say the US Navy doctrine at the time really focused on long-range gunfights, right? So a lot of the plans that the US Navy had for engagements basically were like, let's form up our battle line as early as possible and engage the enemy battleships at 30,000 yards, which is 17 miles. So that's like, if we're in a battleship right here at the observatory, right? That's like us shooting a gun all the way to Minden and expecting to hit something with a 6% chance of success, right? While that target is moving and we're moving too on the ocean. So there we go. So that's why this spotting is so hugely important, right? So if you have good airplanes, you can not only tie down the enemies, but you can also guide your shells onto their ships, and you can prevent their airplanes from guiding their shells onto your ships, right? So again, that's why all of these various design choices are going on. The design choices with range and with reliability and all of this stuff. And all of that gets us to this airplane. This is one of my favorites, by the way, the F-11C. So there we go. Can you read it yet? What's the F for? Fighter, yes, there we go. Which design was it? The 11th one. Does anybody know what the C company is? Any guesses? I'm going to let you guess while I take a drink of water. This is why I ask questions, so I can drink. I don't even know if they're a thing yet. Yeah, I think they did have stuff like in the in World War II, but Curtiss. It's going to be the Curtiss company. Yeah. Yeah, they're a long design, right? So there you go. So when you see the C, that means Curtiss. So this is the easy version of that, by the way. F-11C, it actually has several subtypes, several modifications. Sometimes it's also known as the BFC, which would mean bomber fighter. So again, we're looking at dual purpose aircraft here, because if you find the fleet, why not drop some ordnance on it? And then, of course, it might have like, there's like the BFC2 and all of the, I don't know. It's confusing. We probably don't need to get into this. I always think it's like trying to like memorize the French royalty or something, right? You never get it because there's too many Louis. But anyway, so I'm taking this aircraft because this is a really cool one. If you want to see one, go to Florida. I think it's in Pensacola where you can go see this in the actual museum there. This one I'm taking a little bit out of order, but I think it's important because it's more of a transition design. And I think most visibly apparent is that the airplane is going to begin with these spatted landing gear, right? So they're fixed landing gear. They tried to make them more aerodynamic by putting the little teardrop things on them and all that. It looks cool. But later on, they're going to add these retractable landing gear after they were shown to be effective on the FF1. We'll talk about the FF1 in a minute. But there's that. That's a Grumman-style landing gear. And so that's one of those things that's going to be an interesting transition. And again, this one is really illustrative of the Navy's design choices for fighter bombers. So this one Yeah, it can shoot down other planes with its two 30 caliber machine guns, but it could also carry a 500-pound bomb. I don't know if that's what this is. It doesn't look like it's 500 pounds to me, but maybe I'm wrong. And of course, it could then it could strike the enemy fleet with those bombs, strafe them, shoot down enemy planes, things like that. The guns too, I think this is a good design choice in this case. The guns, they actually move into the cowl in this one. So they're firing through the propeller arc in the cowl. And it's around this time that guns start to be reliable enough where they don't have to be right next to the pilot. If you ever wondered that, you guys ever watch a World War I movie and they're like guns are like right there? That's because they sucked so bad and they got jammed all the time. The pilots literally had a hammer in the cockpit so they could slam down the cocking bolt if it got stuck. If you read any of the Biggles books or anything, it's like I was firing, pop, pop, and all of a sudden it stopped, and I had to, like hammer away at this thing. It's this really fascinating thing. So the guns start to get reliable enough where you can actually have them like on the wings. I think the cowling is a great way though, because in the cowling, you're shooting like this at somebody, right? I'm sorry I keep shooting at you, by the way, when I point things. I'm not trying to kill you, but you're in the line of fire. Anyway, so if you have your guns in the cowling, you just have them aimed forward. If your guns are out on the wings, though, then you have to say, well, how far away do I want to shoot somebody? If it's going to be 300 yards, then I need to angle my guns in so that they converge on a point 300 yards away, right? Now I'm shooting your daughter. I'm sorry. I'm shooting all the people out here. But anyway, so there we go. The problem with that, though, is like, how accurate is that going to be per gun? And then if you think about that, each gun has its own cone of fire, right? Because those bullets aren't lasers. And so each one is going to like have an effective cone that gets bigger and bigger the further and further out it goes. And so I don't know, maybe there's your next probability question. If you have two machine guns that fire 450 rounds per minute, anyway, I'm digressing. You don't need to know this. I don't know why I'm telling you this. All right. So yeah, they fire through the cowling. I think that's good. And again, they're still the 30 caliber. They're still rifle caliber. They're going to get bigger and bigger. But it's still an efficient design. And again, we're talking about these airplanes that have lots of capabilities. The Navy actually orders 28 of these, and they're all assigned to the Saratoga. And the Saratoga carries way more planes than that, but just this little piece of the aircraft complement on that one aircraft carrier is still a pretty powerful striking arm. If you think about each one of these being able to carry one 500-pound bomb each to another fleet, well, that's pretty darn good, right? Well, that gets us to phase 3, and this is one of my, I don't know, this is one of my favorites. This is the FF1. So this is phase 3 of our pre-World War II fighter design doctrine epic. And remember, in this phase, we're beginning to see a move away from those dual purpose, or you might call them again, multi-mission aircraft, and to more dedicated fighters and bombers and torpedo planes and things like that. But again, interestingly, the pilots would often be cross-trained. Did anybody watch that newer Midway movie? I didn't have high hope. Yeah, I didn't have high hopes, but I went and watched it because I have a crush on Mandy Moore. But anyway, there's a scene where Wade McCluskey gets transferred. They say, hey, you're not going to be a fighter anymore. You're going to be a bomber. And he says, okay. And it's that easy because they were cross-trained. They could do that. And so that's, I don't know, that's a dumb example of what I'm talking about here. And again, I think it helps to illustrate that, yes, the main weapon was the battleship. We're still talking about the battleship, and these planes, even though they're becoming more and more powerful in their own right, are really just there to spot the enemy fleets and weaken them before a decisive contact between battleships, and of course dominate the sky above any engagement. It'd always be nice, by the way, if you're shooting at somebody, not to have planes dropping bombs on you, right? That's a good thing. And so if you have fighters, you can do that. And we get to begin with the FF1 because this is such a remarkable aircraft. It's kind of silly looking. I don't know. You guys get it? It looks like a guppy or, a tadpole or something like that. There's a bunch of those that the planes start looking like things to me. I don't know if that's like a Rorschach sort of thing, but anyway. So there are so many things about this. We've alluded to it enough, and there's 3 big things that I want you to know about the Fifi. And it was called the Fifi, by the way, the pilots, it's FF1, so they called it the Fifi. That's not one of the important things about it, though. But anyway, first off, the big important thing is the landing gear. This is such a huge deal because the landing gear is a really important thing. I mean, if you want to land the aircraft, let's put it that way. That's an important thing, right? And this is actually the first use of retractable landing gear on a Navy plane. This is the Grumman, well, of a Navy fighter, I should say. And so this is a Grumman design. It's actually predates Grumman, but the guy who designed it then sold it to Grumman and then retained a big share of that company. So we'll call it a Grumman design. And it's going to be characteristic on Grumman planes for a long time. And really the big deal is aerodynamics, right? Those fixed landing gear are nice, but they produce lots of drag. That's why they put those, you know, goofy teardrop spats on the landing gear and everything to try to reduce drag. But wouldn't it be great if you could just remove the landing gear during flight? The problem is if you have retractable landing gear, that weakens the landing gear. And that might not be, excuse me, as big of a deal if you're flying on a land plane, because then you can have a runway that's just like 12 miles long and you just slowly, gradually get down. But if you're flying a Navy plane, you have like 25 feet in which you need to land this plane. And those Navy pilots, they come in and bam, they hit the deck like that, catch an arresting wire really quick. And so if you have weak landing gear, what's going to happen every time you slam your plane down on the deck? It's going to collapse. Say it again. Yeah, there you go. You will no longer have that plane, right? It was a single serving plane. Yeah. And so this particular landing gear, it was strong enough to be able to withstand the very the robust landings of carrier aircraft, right? And so there you go. It's a great landing gear. It's of course going to be superseded, left behind by more advanced designs later on that are even more aerodynamic, that can fit into a wing and so on and so forth. But it's good for the time. It's a really important thing. And again, we're going to see this design being used in World War II as well. And that aerodynamic issue, that actually leads us to the overall performance. This plane, it's fascinating. It's a two-seater, by the way. I don't know if you could tell from the little extra seat there, but the two-seater plane, it was meant to have an observer in the back. So this is technically a scout fighter. But even still, it was it just outclassed everything else, right? So the FF1, it used the same engine as the old F-11C that we just looked at. But even with that engine, this FF1 now had a range of 921 miles. So that's a huge distance more that you can cover, right? Remember, the F-11C only had a 628-mile range. This plane here could fly at 207 miles per hour to the F-11C's 205. So it was a big improvement, right? Big, both in range and capabilities, all sorts of different things. The last thing that we have to know about this is it's a Grumman design. And this is like the beginning of, I don't know, like a match made in heaven. Grumman is such an important design or a aircraft manufacturer for the Navy for decades, right? I mean, what manufacturer built the F-14? Grumman, right? There you go. Exactly. Yeah. So it's a huge deal. It's going to produce, this aircraft manufacturer is going to produce some of the most successful aircraft designs ever. And so there you go. The F2F and the F3F are going to build on the successes of the Fifi. It will basically just continuously upgrade and increase capabilities. And one thing that you may notice, let me give you a little evolution chart. So you have the FF1 right here. And you can tell, by the way, they're written on the vertical stabilizer right there. And then there's the F2F. So again, if you're reading our things, it's a fighter of the second generation of Grumman. Grumman gets the F. So there you go. There's the F2F. And then this is the F3F here. And you can kind of see how they gradually start to improve. They start to get better in all of this. You're going to see that they're all still biplanes, though. I don't know if this is resonating with anybody, but this is like getting into this, to the late 1930s. And by the late 1930s, pretty much everybody was moving to monoplanes. And can anybody guess why monoplanes are so much better? What was it? I got drag and visibility. You're both right. Although visibility was something that a lot of the pilots hated with the monoplanes, because downward visibility, if you have a mid-wing plane, you can't see over your wing, right? And so Grumman will actually fix that by putting a window under the cockpit. So if you're looking down between your legs, you can see downward. And so there you go. That kind of fixes it. And I don't know if later planes continued along with that, but maybe they figure they don't need it. But yeah, visibility is important. If you actually notice, let me go back to these ones. It's hard to tell, but can you see how in the F2B, the wing is higher than it is in the F3B? And the reason why is because if you lower the wing from here to here, it might seem like that wing is right in front of your face and it's going to block your vision. But because of the geometry of it, you actually have better upward vision this way. And it's easier to just kind of like do this to look under it. So vision is actually a pretty important thing, yes. The most important thing, at least I'll argue the most important thing, is drag, right? Look at you got a whole extra wing that's going to produce drag. You've got all of these struts that produces drag. Initially, all of that stuff created strength in your airplane. It held everything together, but it also produces drag. And if you remove that, you get so much faster of an airplane. So yeah, most of these aircraft designers for the Army and for other nations are looking at monoplanes. And it's not like the Navy isn't looking at monoplanes, but I think a lot of people want to chalk it up to like naval conservatism, right? Well, the Navy's stuck in their ways, right? Like just like how they wanted to stick with the battleships. But I mean, who could have told, other than one Japanese admiral, that the aircraft were going to be the big thing, right? In the same case, I don't think it's naval conservatism here. I think it's that the Navy was trying to make sure they had a good design. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have a question? It's one set of wings, right? So if you see, these are biplanes. So it's got two wings, and they might not even be true biplanes. They have all sorts of weird names. Like I think it's called a sesquiplane or something, where it's got one wing and then like a half a wing under it. So there's all sorts of weird ones that you can do. That would describe the F-11C. It has like a little baby wing on the bottom that helps provide the strength, but maybe produces less drag. So there's that. Let me move on. So the Navy was still looking at monoplanes. They wanted the monoplanes too. They wanted the better stuff. They wanted the modern things and all of this. But practically speaking, there weren't any designers that were producing monoplanes that would work for the Navy's needs. So I think the Navy was thinking very practically, and so they just simply kept upgrading the F3F, saying this will hold us over until we can get to a good fighter plane that has just one wing, right? And so there you go. One thing I also think that you might notice here is the shift from the two-seat scout fighter design in the Fifi to the dedicated monoplane. If you notice, this one has the extra seat for an observer, and then they just said, oh, we don't need to observe things from behind. We'll just shoot at stuff in front of us, and there you go. This, by the way, is the F4F, and this is what the Navy will have on hand, along with another design in the beginning. And so this will get us to the monoplanes, because the Navy says, yes, we want one. And what do they want? Well, not the F4F. Has anybody ever heard of the Brewster Buffalo? No? Okay. I was hoping somebody had, because every so often there's like, there's somebody who's just as much of a nerd as I am, and they're like, oh, the Brewster Buffalo. If you hear about the Brewster Buffalo, it's usually really negative stuff. I mean, just look at it, right? It's all stumpy and everything, What's that?
It's like a bumblebee.
It kind of does. Yeah, it's just, I mean, it looks like it chased a parked car, that sort of a thing. It's I should say, in all fairness to the Buffalo, again, it gets a lot of bad press. And the reason it gets a lot of bad press is because it was completely outclassed by the Japanese Zero. All right, so it was a worse plane than the Japanese Zero. It could kind of hold its own in certain circumstances, but generally speaking, the Zero just ran circles around it and knocked these out of the sky like it was nobody's business. So, yeah, it was the first of the monoplanes, and I guess I shouldn't say the first of the monoplanes. It was the first monoplane fighter. The first Navy monoplane was the TBD Devastator. It was a torpedo plane. Look those up, by the way. Look up TBD Devastator when you get home. It looks like it's trying to kiss you. It's a weird one. Like I said, there's goofy looking things, but there's one of them. So the Buffalo is a Brewster design, and Brewster is a company that we haven't actually talked about yet, because they don't have a whole lot of airplanes. This is actually their first design. Technically, it's called the F2A, but that's because the FA was already claimed by somebody else. And it really, I should say, it wasn't that bad. Now, yes, it didn't do what it was supposed to do, but it wasn't that bad. And the reason I say it wasn't that bad, because it did have some success in Finland. There's a whole story behind that. If you know, you know. But anyway, it was okay. But and by the way, when I say just look at it, it looks dumb, right? Most rotary engine planes at the time looked like that. They were stumpy, right? If you look at the Russians had the I-16, I think it was, and it looks just like this goofy little stumpy toy or something like that. Is it the P-36? And it's the pea shooter, right? And it has kind of that same sort of stumpy sort of look. And so I guess aerodynamically, that was the best they came up with in all of this, but it was essentially a technological dead end. It wasn't good enough, right? It was too lightly armored. It was too slow. It was not maneuverable enough. It overheated and so on. And that might be why it had success in Finland, because it didn't overheat up there, but it just didn't quite work. The F4F, by contrast, was a much better aircraft. And it's interesting because initially, Grumman with the F4F lost the contract for the Navy's first monoplane fighter. But luckily, because Grumman had done so much good stuff with all of those other FFs, right? They had a good relationship with the Navy, and the Navy said, well, why don't you keep developing this? And they did, and they came up with actually a very good design. And again, this aircraft was much more well-rounded. It was a much more capable aircraft, and it's going to actually serve until the very end of World War II, by the way, with distinction. And I might shock some of you. I don't know if anybody's as invested in this kind of thing as I am, but I contend that the F4F was a better aircraft than the Zero. Let me try that again, but everybody like go, oh, ready? Okay, so the F4F was a better aircraft than the Zero. I know, it is shocking, right? But what's that? Well, there's a bunch of things about the F4F. It was a more well-rounded weapon. It had better armor. It had better speed, at least when it was going down, right? Intentionally, I should say, going down, right? And so there are a whole bunch of things about it that just made it a more robust platform. And in fact, when you're looking at the kill ratios and all this, there were, I think it was 6.9 kills per one loss for the F4F. So it shot down quite a few aircraft. And keep in mind, this is the airplane that the United States had on hand at the beginning of World War II, when Japan had like its best pilots ever, which were probably the best pilots ever. The Japanese pilots in the beginning of World War II were like, they were something else, like superhuman. And anyway, so there's that. So the F4F-3, it had the range. It could go 845 miles. It had a top speed of 331 miles per hour. So you can see we've gotten quite a bit faster in these airplanes. This one sported 4 50 caliber machine guns, and it could carry 2 bombs, but more likely it would carry what you see under the wing right there, drop tanks, so that you can increase the range, right? So those are for gasoline. And of course, this is going to be the plane that would be on hand to meet the Japanese, because can you imagine what would have happened if all we had were Brewster Buffaloes? I don't know if you could or not, but there's that. So this last image, by the way, this is kind of going back in time a little bit. This is Guantanamo Bay. Can anybody see the Langley? I think it's right there. It's the one that's flat, right? So there it is. That's the aircraft carrier. This is Guantanamo Bay in 1927. And all of this stuff again fits into the Navy's doctrine. When we're talking about these fighters, what they're supposed to do and how we're going to use them, they're an auxiliary. They're a defensive weapon meant to protect our own strike aircraft and our own ships while our ships are slugging it out with enemy battleships. It's supposed to be the big 16-inch guns duking it out and that kind of business. Maybe these aircraft could supplement the battle line by disrupting formation, right? Keeping the enemy from getting into that battle line so they could fire at you and that kind of business. So they can't deploy. Maybe they could blind the enemy so that they can't see where their shots are falling, that kind of business. But really, these new monoplane fighters are going to fit in that scheme, mostly just to prevent enemy fleets from seeing you, from doing the same kind of stuff to you, right? And so that need to have these fast and powerful fighters with good range, in this case, was a must. But they don't have to have huge, stupid, crazy ranges like the Japanese planes, right? Because we're not going to like try to strike targets 1,000 miles away. We want to get in close in all of this. And so, again, the idea here is to make the best use of these things so that these fighters can fit into a combined arms attack. And what's funny about this, and this, I know this is kind of like right on the cusp of World War II here and everything. What's funny about this is that the United States, of course, is going to go to war with Japan. And the doctrine that the US Navy had almost dovetailed perfectly with the plan that Japan had to counter the United States Navy. And it's a little bit weird, just from a doctrinal standpoint, the Japanese idea of how to fight the battle was probably better. Like the way they thought of it, they probably had the United States duped because they could shoot further, they had better planes, all that kind of business. So it's probably kind of ironic that when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they scrapped that plan that was way better than the one the Americans had and showed everybody, hey, it's about massed air attack. And then the United States goes and builds 17 freaking aircraft carriers. Anyway, so there's that. That's a story for another day and all of this, but that's the basic overview. I see I'm over an hour now and everybody's starting to yawn. This is what my class normally looks like 5 minutes in. So you guys have been way better than my normal classes, but I'll stop it there. And I guess I could open it up to various questions and things about all of this. We could play Stump the Chump if you want. And yes.
So that Buffalo plane, so I'm assuming that's a machine gun in the front, right? In front of the windshield?
That's actually a sight.
Oh.
Yeah, that's a telescopic, this little doodad right there, yeah? Yeah, that's a telescopic sight. And they ended up getting rid of those because, one, if you're sitting there looking like this, right? And I'm trying to shoot you, flying like this, looking through my sight, what happens when Fighter Tom over here jumps me? I die, right? Exactly. So it's nicer if I can like just, engage you here. And the other thing is, realistically, you're not going to hit anything from 600 yards away. Just the way these things, I mean, the whole plane is vibrating, right? The cones of fire get so big and all of this. And so really realistic range is more like within 300 yards. And so they'll actually scrap those. That's why you see on the F4F, it's not there anymore, right? But yeah, they had those sights on there early. The guns are actually kind of hidden. There's some in the cowling here, and then there's wing mounted ones as well.
So I guess that would reiterate my question with the guns being in front of the propeller and in the rear of the propeller. Are they timed with the blades?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things. Like when fighter aircraft were in their infancy, that was the main thing to overcome. Was how do you shoot through your propeller blade without shooting your propeller blade, right?
So another time between space between, say, at this position, when the next propellers come by.
Mm-hmm.
So they know that time. So they know how far the gun is behind it. They know the distance traveled. They know the velocity, the muzzle velocity, so they can get through there every time. That seems
Exactly.
almost impossible, but I guess you can do that.
And they did
Now,
that.
how do they know the start? How do they know when to start though? How? I mean, there's gotta be a timing somewhere.
There's a gear. And so there's a gear that works with the propeller and sets up there. And this is an invention from World War I, from like, I think 1915 is when the first one started to come up. The French actually, they started off by putting armored plates on their propellers, deflector plates.
They have a ratio, this number of rotations for this number of rotations.
Yeah.
So that get it down. Okay.
Yeah, and so they've got it figured out. And so what that'll do is like if your blade is spinning like this, right? And your gun's right here, it's gonna go fire, 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 stop, fire, 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 stop. And so it'll do that. Yeah, it's not as apparent on these later guns because the tolerances become so it's like, you know, it's like firing any other gun, you know. But on the old World War I guns, it was noticeably different. If you looked at the same gun that was fired from a British aircraft, right, like a Sopwith Pup, it would be like pop, 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 pop. Whereas that same gun on ground in infantry hands would be like pop, 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 pop.
But also somehow they gotta be able to feel without timing on the timing sequence. When you pull the trigger, it's gotta be within a certain tolerance too, right?
Well, that pulling of the trigger, right, or the pressing of the button or what have you, that will engage the system. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's incredible engineering stuff, right? That it's like it's down because I mean, I don't know. Somebody quickly calculate, you know, how quickly that propeller spin. Yeah, exactly. It's nuts. Yeah, I think it was you and then you. Yeah.
I got a doctrine question.
Okay.
As far as battleships versus aircraft carriers, who are the big names who are supporting the aircraft carriers and who are the big names like clinging to the battleships?
So I don't know that there was anyone that you could say was necessarily clinging to the battleships at the time. There were a few folks. So like if we're talking like 1941, right? November of 1941, right before the Japanese start, you know, dropping bombs. There were a few people who started to notice the writing on the wall and they said, hey, maybe aircraft carriers are the wave of the future, right? I'm not sure that they still would have thought of them in the same way that Yamamoto was kind of. A lot of people think of Yamamoto as a real visionary. He's a Japanese admiral, if you couldn't tell. But anyway, a lot of people think of him as real visionary in all this. I'm not sure that's the case. I think he was a gambler, and I think his whole thing was like, I've got this arm that from the get-go could knock out the American battleships.
Fast, flexible, long range.
Yeah. And here's the thing. Here's the reason why I say he was a gambler. He was willing to throw away all the aircraft carriers that he had to destroy the American battleships.
And he pretty much did.
So, well, eventually it takes about 6 months, but that I think should go to show that even Yamamoto himself, even though he understood the capabilities of massed air attack of a combined force of aircraft carriers, I think he still had this idea that, well, battleships have a role. So when we're talking about doctrines and stuff, there's probably a few names of people who were like, I think we should pay more attention to aircraft carriers. If I had to take a guess, because I can't answer that with any certainty, but if I had to take a guess, Bill Halsey would be the guy. Admiral Halsey would be the one where I would say he probably was looking at the aircraft carrier a little bit more than other folks. But I can't say with any certainty in like 1940 or 1941 or something.
But like 1942, 43, everybody gets it by then.
How do you not get it?
Yeah.
It's like, look at the bottom of Pearl Harbor and you'll understand, right, what the real weapon here is. Look at how and by then too, it's like, okay, well, the Americans don't have battleships anymore. So what are you going to fight with? Well, the Japanese just showed us what to fight with. Let's do that. And there you go. And then, of course, we have the U.S. Manufacturing Center, which cranks out billions of planes and everything. So, yeah.
Okay, so why did the Navy have planes? Was it just because like they could land on the carrier ships? Like I'm not sure when like the Air Force came in, but like why do they have planes?
Why does the Navy specifically want to develop planes?
Yeah, but like it like usually when you think of the Navy, you think it's like ships and
Mhm.
stuff, like on the water. So does
Well,
that
the
just
Army had planes too.
Yeah, and I mean the thing is the Navy is going to get the planes after the Army. The Army is going to show the Navy essentially how these things can be used, right? I mean, all the stuff we're talking about here is essentially developed in the trenches or over the trenches of World War I, right? And so when the Navy is looking at these aircraft and saying, well, gosh, that sounds like a good idea for us, they're essentially saying, well, how can we use this new weapon to achieve our goals?
To supplement their fuel armament.
Exactly. And their whole idea, basically during this whole time period, was this would be awesome to have flying over a battle line of battleships, duking it out and slugging each other to death. And I mean, honestly, if you thought about it, if you think about it, if there was to be a battle like that, you probably could see some similarities of it probably would pan out the way people thought it was going to. So
So if you go back to the picture with the F3F, yeah,
these guys,
yeah, so some of them say US Marines.
yeah.
So is that why?
Are there any Marines that I'm going to piss off?
I could jump in if you want.
Well, I mean, the thing is that the Marines are going to use a lot of Navy equipment, right? I mean, that's what Marines stands
The
for.
Marines are under, I'll just say, it, the Marines are under the Department of the Navy. So the Marine mission of aircraft is a little bit different than the Navy, but the Navy trains all the Marine Corps aviators. The Marines fly Navy planes, except in some exceptions. But like, those would be used for ground attacks. So the primary mission of the Marine Corps aviation is to support the riflemen on the ground. So that would maybe attack ground targets. You know, if a Marine unit gets in a bad situation, they'll call in an airstrike, they'll take out the threat, and the ground units can move forward, you know, uninhibited.
Well, and again, remember that these fighter aircraft are predominantly defensive. And so when we look at the F4F, for example, this monoplane here, that gains quite a bit of notoriety for defending the Marines over Guadalcanal. And so, and honestly, I think a lot of the things, a lot of the characteristics that you would want in a Navy plane would be important for the Marines as well, because I mean, the Marines are going to be in advanced positions on islands or something like that, where they don't have a lot of storage space for aviation gas. Supply might be a problem. Big ground crews might be a problem. You might have very short runways where you don't get to have the 30 miles that you have on an Air Force runway or something like that, right? And so I think it makes sense too. But yeah, essentially the Marines, well, I mean, they do the fighting and the Navy does the carrying, right? So, I'll help you out, right?
We can't get there without them.
That's right. Yeah.
We can't get there without the Air Force either.
My Marine friend says that Marine stands for my ass rides on Navy equipment. So
USMC stands for Uncle Sam's Misguided Children.
yeah. Any other questions?
I have.
Yes.
So it's pretty clear as you go from earlier aircraft with no cockpits to aircraft with cockpits.
You mean the
like
canopies?
The canopies, yeah. That are, and is that primarily because they were just going faster? Or was there any other utility to that?
To the closed canopy?
The closed canopy.
Well, there's a couple of things that you can do. Yeah, there's you're going faster. There is an aerodynamic advantage, right? If it's closed. There was actually, and if you notice, it's the Fifi that has that that first closed cockpit all the way enclosed. So this is, you know, the F-11, and here's the Fifi. And so the pilots themselves actually had a little bit of misgivings about the closed cockpit, because their big argument was, what if you have to get out in a hurry? And I have to sit here and roll down the window, essentially, right? And that can be hard to do if, you know, your engine is blowing flames into your face, right? So there's that. But the big advantage is, I think, aerodynamics. But of course, later on, it will be, it's just nice not to have,
The other
you
thing I
know.
noticed is even a lot of the pictures in flight. There's a pilot and he's got the canopy open.
There he is. Yeah. And I mean, that was,
Canopy, but it's open.
So you're not going so fast that you can't have it open.
no, you could, and a lot of people did. There was again, there's a lot of, it's one of those things you could call this pilot conservatism, actually, right? And there were a lot of pilots who said, no, we don't want the things. In World War I, there were even folks who didn't like the windscreen in front because it would block them from smelling the other airplanes. In World War, seriously, they burned castor oil in their engines, and that's how they lubricated. And so if they smelled extra burnt castor oil, like, hey, there's a plane around here. So But yeah, there's a whole bunch of things with that. And when you go into a fight, you probably want to button up. You probably want to close the cockpit. But yeah, if you're going super fast, it improves aerodynamics. Of course, you don't have the wind blowing right past you and all of this. And so I think aerodynamics at this point are probably the big thing because they're not pressurized yet. So
The speed are going up, so they have to have more efficiency.
yeah. Well, and especially when you start getting into these, and then you'll start to see, of course, through World War II, you start to get really nice streamlined designs and all this. Yeah.
So, of that star with the circle around it, like when did they start putting them there? Like which ones had them, which ones didn't, and like when did you stop doing that?
Well, we have a similar one now, but it's got like the cool bars on the side too. You know, I'm not entirely certain. That's called the roundel though, and if I'm not mistaken, it was the British who started the roundel tradition. They started off, by the way, with just like, you know, the British flag is called the Union Jack, and they just started with that. But apparently that looked too much like the Iron Cross that the German planes in World War I had. And it confused people.
Those.
Exactly. So they did the roundels. And of course, theirs looks like a target now. So I don't know how that helps. But anyway, there's actually an interesting story about this particular one. If you notice, let me go back and show you. Oh, come on. Oh, here we go. Okay. Do you see in the back how there's this roundel here? And there's a red dot in the middle? Prior to World War II, all of the US Navy roundels had that red dot in the middle because red, white, and blue, right? You want to show off our proud colors and all of this. But after Pearl Harbor and after we go to fighting with the Japanese, they removed the red dot because, again, they were afraid that when pilots saw a red dot, they wouldn't care if there was a star. It's a Jap, let's get them, you know? And so there's that. It's like, I don't know if anybody hunts, but when you hunt, if you get a deer, you're supposed to like wrap a bunch of orange tape around the rack so people don't see a rack and say a deer. So there's a, yeah, I mean, friendly fire is an important thing. And honestly, this happens quite a bit, right? There's a story from the European War in World War II where there was a Mustang pilot who got shot up by one of the P-47s because the P-47 saw the profile of the Mustang and didn't care to look at the roundels, but just started shooting because the Mustang looked like one of the German planes. And so he was like, get him. And then all of a sudden he like realized his mistake, stopped, and this poor Mustang pilot's like limping his plane back, and the other pilot goes up next to him and goes, whoopsie. Yeah. Any other questions?
Is there a way to bail out of these and why?
Yes. Yes, there is. It's kind of dangerous. I mean, I don't think the ejection seat comes around till the jet age, but basically it's unbuckle, roll down the window, and get out. And I don't know if there's a specific order to those things, but
You jump for the trailing edge of the wave.
there you go. Yeah. So get out of there and don't hit the vertical stabilizer or the horizontal stabilizers as they go past. Yeah.
Don't you have to put your parachute on first?
Well, yeah, that's actually what you're sitting on usually. Yeah.
Oh, you've already got it on.
Yeah, you're already strapped in and all that. You've got all your cool apparatus and everything. That's one nice thing that they started doing after World War I. The poor World War I pilots didn't get parachutes, so just don't crash. Yeah, so stop getting shot down. Bunch of sissies.
Jump out and hit like some nice comfy trees.
Well, it's interesting you say that because there are instances of those World War I planes because they're World War I planes. And so sometimes they would crash into trees and then the pilot would have to like climb down the tree because he was going 35 miles an hour when he crashed. So anyway.
How long was it the time the Wright brothers started their first flight to the bi-wing plane developed? How long was that?
Well, the Wright brothers, the Kitty Hawk, that was technically like a biplane sort of design. They had to kind of do that. And there was an interesting period kind of between 1910 and 1914 where the monoplane design was popular for a while. But because you're building these things out of wood and fabric, they were so fragile that when you start getting up to these higher, and I say high power, meaning like 80 horsepower engines, right? You needed to have the structure because it's the box framing essentially, right? And all those wires that you see, like right here, these are tensioning wires. They're there to pull this thing together and provide that strength that you need, especially, I mean, if you're thinking about these fighter planes, right? You're putting them through a lot of stress. I talked about wing loading. Do you guys know anything about wing loading? I don't really know a whole lot about wing loading either, but it's basically, if I understand it correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's basically your wing area to weight ratio. So if you look at a lot of modern jet planes, they've got like really, really, really high wing load, where it's like, you know, you look at the commercial airliners and you think, how can those things fly? Because their wings are like this big and the body's like this big. Whereas a butterfly has really, really, really low wing loading. And so that's because they've got this wing that's like this big and they weigh like 1/1000th of an ounce. So if you have that wing loading, did I get it right? Okay, cool, awesome. So if you have that low wing loading, that means you can make tighter turns without basically like folding your airplane up on itself.
Next time you fly and get a window seat and watch the wings.
Don't do that.
That's, I always.
That's mean. Yeah.
Especially when all the flaps.
Yeah, it's,
Uh-huh.
I actually was sitting next to a lady once on flight. She was at the window and I was in the middle seat. And she looks up, oh my gosh, the wing's flapping. I'm like, it either flaps or it breaks off. She goes, oh, I hope it keeps flapping. But you could see, you know, you could see the ends, the tips of the wings do flapping
Yeah.
like that. And they're supposed to. And that's part of that wing load. There's structure there that allows the wing to still produce lift. Really, the purpose of the wing from a physics standpoint is push air down so that the Newton's third law reaction is the air pushes you up. And so that, you know, but how hard you can push depends on what it's made out of.
Right.
And you can push more air harder with a bigger area, but then you have more stuff, which weighs more.
Yeah.
But then the lift comes from the differential pressure you're lifting up because as the wind
Kind of, but-
as the fluid goes over the top of the.
Kind of, Robert, but think about flying upside down. It's not just that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you get that.
But when you're talking about the flying upside down, those are like modern airplanes and modern jets. And I think at that point, you're going so fast that it's more like cutting through the air.
That you can flip it. There's a thing called angle of attack.
Mhm.
That's why there are flaps and ailerons
Yeah.
and whatever on the part, right? That's, you can adjust the shape of your wing on purpose. That's how you can fly upside down your platform.
Interesting. Well, there you go.
Go back to the butterfly.
The butterfly. Okay.
It has a low wing load.
Okay.
So
Ultra maneuverable, right? Have you ever seen a butterfly and it could just like, right? Okay. So keep going.
I just want
You just want to talk about. Well, I mean, that's actually a good thing to think about, right? So if you have super low wing loading, that would be like the Japanese Zero that I can bring. Does anybody figure out by now that that's my favorite airplane? Anyway, so it had super low wing loading because it was amazingly light, had a big wing area, and it could turn on a dime, right? I would argue that the Japanese Zero was the best dogfighter of World War II. And I'm probably going to piss people off because people really invested in what dogfighters were great. Somebody likes the Corsair, don't they? Yeah, see, I knew it. Yeah. The A6M2, yeah.
Yeah, that's how we lost our pilots, because the Zero could turn on the inside of
Mm-hmm.
our aircraft and nail it.
But here's the
But
thing.
The problem was they did not have CE fuel tanks, so if you lit off their tank with tracer around, the whole thing just turned into a fireball.
And that's the downside. Yeah. But that's how the Americans defeated it with that doctrine, right? They basically said, don't dogfight them. If you even look at the manuals for the Corsairs and for the F6F airplanes, which were better airplanes than the Zero, the manual said, don't turn with them. Don't turn with the Zero. If you get into a turning fight, dive and get away. Run away. And then get to altitude and shoot his ass down. All right. Any other? What's that?
I said, fly straight down.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so, fighter pilots.
Oh, cool.
47s,
Neat.
38s.
And they, because we had so much armor and ceiling tanks, the way to really get to zero was to fly straight at it and just open your guns.
That's one of the ways, yeah.
Because as soon as you tipped off that fuel tank, the thing just went into your firewall.
That's right.
Doctrinally, we could also replace pilots and airplanes at a much faster rate too. Like the zero pilots you're talking about at the beginning of the war, we served in Raval, China and all that.
Mhm.
Like the screening process for them was insane.
It was
It
ridiculous.
was like Olympic,
Yeah.
like Olympic standards. I
Yeah.
mean,
When
It
you
was
look at
an-
Japanese
yeah.
pilots were better, was because they could withstand, they trained to withstand G forces better, you know.
They trained those, so for one, like we said, just to be able to be considered for fighter pilot training, you had to essentially be like an Olympian, right? You had to be the most amazing thing. These guys would be able to like talk about astronomy. They would train their eyes so that they could pick out stars in daytime, right? Like that's how they would go. They would do the thing like Karate Kid and like catch flies with chopsticks and stuff like that. Like they would go to think, and Japanese training in and of itself was just like a whole other tier of insanity, both in brutality and also effectiveness.
About the Japanese training, my stepmom is Japanese, her father started in an exhibition plant during World War II.
Oh, okay.
And so he is, being Japanese, is familiar with the training. And most of their training was done on a soapbox with a broomstick. And a guy stood up on a table out front, said, "Turn this way." That's what they did. They had another guy that stayed behind the little box, and he could operate the little dials. So as the guy was talking, they had no pilots. They lost them all in Midway.
That was
They lost
the
their best pilots
yeah.
in Midway, so they were trying to fill them up, but they had no training, they had no aircraft. Matter of fact, over 50%, over 50% of the fighter pilots that were sent out never flew a plane.
Probably. And what you're describing there is after Midway. This is at the end of the war when the fighter pilot training just basically collapsed. There's actually some fun if you guys like Japanese film, the Toho was a World War II film company, and they would basically create videos that were like that with the broomstick. And it was basically like, this is what it will look like if you turn your joystick this way. Because they didn't have the planes to be able to train these guys. But in the beginning of the war, 1938-39, they were going nuts. And so when I talk about Japanese pilots being better pilots, that's just training, but it's also just simply a matter of experience as well. Because one of the things people don't realize is that when the United States joined World War II at the end of 1941, Japan had already been at war for 5 years. Right? They began in 1937. And so their Navy pilots had operational experience for 5 years of flying their planes, of fighting their planes, of understanding how to use these machines and everything. So that's why. And that's why Midway and why, not just Midway, actually, Midway wasn't as devastating to the pilots as many assume. It was actually Guadalcanal. It was actually that whole campaign around Guadalcanal that bled the Japanese Navy white and essentially removed their capabilities and their good pilots and got to that point that you're describing there. So, yeah.
The best pilots were in the Navy. That was after Midway, especially when it got hot, they downloading, changing them from bombs to torpedoes. They got hit with something. All the experienced pilots.
I'm gonna.
Were gone.
I've got to make a book plug here, and this is something that you especially, but maybe everybody else. This is one of these things where this might be the crowd where everyone can get it. There's a great book called Shattered Sword, and I think it's Anthony Tully and John Parshall.
Shattered what?
Shattered Sword. It's an incredibly in-depth study of Midway, and we've all been told it's the changing over from torpedoes to bombs, and they prove it wrong. And they prove it wrong from Japanese Navy things. There's a long story, but read the book. Read the book. It's great. Anyway. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm gonna stop the recording anyway, but feel free to hang around and keep chatting.
And that's all there was. By the way, since I opened the lecture to questions at the time, again, if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, I wish you joy in your lives, and I hope to see you again soon.